everybody, Cal Banyan here, and yes, you guessed it, Cal Banyan's Hypnosis, etc. If you're watching this anywhere except calbanyan.com, you want to go there right now, because right below this video on calbanyan.com are links, very important link this time, probably a very, very important link, because this is part 2 of the video series. And there'll be a link so that you can just click on it and go right over to part 1 if you have not already seen it. And there's also probably some other graphics and text that support and just make this an all-around more important than ever podcast. Gosh, who do we have here today? Well, you should know if you've watched part 1. This is about the son of Dave Elman. He's here at the Banyan Hypnosis Center. He's answering all the questions I'm throwing at him. As I'm reaching over here, you see me reach out, I'm holding up pictures that Larry Elman gave me of his father teaching and also writing and also working on the radio, and this really, really cool picture of his dad as a very young man back working in vaudeville. Let me just say a couple things about Larry Elman. Besides being the son of the fabulous Dave Elman, I'll just run through a couple of things real quick so you know who it is. He's been through Dave Elman's course 3 times. He's one of the very, 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 very few known people to have ever gone through his course, especially who are not medical professionals. They're still around today doing hypnosis. He's a graduate from MIT. He was in the Air Force. He was a colonel. He's a retired colonel, U.S. Air Force right now. He now is a speaker and trainer on his father's work. Working both in medical hypnosis and other kinds of transformative hypnosis like hypnotherapy. And he has spoken at the National Guild of Hypnotists Convention for the last 2 years. I think he's going to be a regular. That's what I think. All right, that's it. How you doing, Larry?
Pretty good, and thank you, Cal.
Hey, I'm so excited you could stick around for another podcast, because I tell you what, we could put out 15 of these just talking about your dad. His contribution was so great to the profession, especially for the 1%ers and 5-pathers out there. All right, let's see. Where should I begin? One of the things I wanted to get in, because these 20 minutes, they go by so quickly, is I would like to have you talk a little bit about the 3 credibilities that you really kind of pull out and really think it's essential that the people doing hypnosis, and particularly your father's work, should understand. Isn't that right?
I believe so, yes.
Please tell us about them.
Okay. I look upon these as something that the hypnotherapist should bear in mind at all times, because they give him a mental checklist on how to proceed, and also they give him a vehicle for analyzing his successes and failures to know what it is that made things work. Remember that credibility is the coin of the realm in hypnosis. If you don't have credibility, nobody's going to follow your suggestions, period. Well, that's an easy thing to say, but credibility covers the entire session. That's not going to give you a checklist. So I've broken it down into 3 credibilities that you can use as your reference point. The first is that the subject, client, patient, whichever is your situation, has to have credibility in you. That's not just that you came in wearing a good suit and you speak professionally and you give a good professional image. It means you have to put over a belief in what you're doing, you have to act professionally, and you have to convince the subject that you know what you're doing. The second I'll interrupt myself. A good example of that credibility is that if your induction takes so long that the client gets bored, the client loses credibility in you. If your induction is fast enough so the client in the back of his mind is saying, wow, this guy knows what he's doing because I'm there already, you've gained credibility. Now, that's not the only way to gain credibility, but it's a way that any good hypnotist can relate to. You don't bore the subject, you keep him believing in you. The second credibility is the subject must believe in the process. A good example of this is, and I'm ignoring stage hypnosis because there are reasons in stage hypnosis where the subject will believe in the process even when it's crazy. But in a hypnotherapist situation, if you gave a suggestion that the person jump out the window and flap their arms like wings, the subject is not going to take that suggestion. It is not credible. If you give a suggestion that you're going to go 1,000,000 times deeper on your next breath, it's not going to take. The subject cannot even visualize what 1,000,000 times deeper is. You change that same suggestion to, on the next breath, you're going to go twice as deep. The subject finds that credible. The subject can do it. You go into regression. If the first point in regression that you hit were a point that the subject doesn't remember but has a clue to, almost remembers, and have them pick up things that, because they almost remember, give them a reference point, they suddenly say, oh, I believe in regression. You can then take them any place. They're going to be willing to go. So regardless of what your process is, you want them believing in the process. The third credibility is the subject must believe in themselves. If they don't believe they can follow your suggestion, they're not going to do it. That shows up in any good hypnotist always saying, you're doing fine. That's right. You did great. You give them a test, the test doesn't work. You don't say, oh boy, that test didn't work. You don't do that. You say, you did fine, then you back up, you give some deepeners, you switch the subject, you come back to that test later, or a test that proves to you the same thing. But you don't tell them you goofed. You give them confidence. The subject can't make a mistake. The subject's always right. The subject is having their confidence built. That gives them credibility in themselves. Summing it up, credibility in the hypnotist, credibility in the process, credibility in themselves. Anytime you lose one of those three, you've lost the fight. So when you have a problem, think back on just which one of those did I lose.
You know, I totally agree with you. I tell my students all the time, I say hypnosis is a confidence game. And I pause for effect and then say, if you don't have their confidence, there's going to be no game. And I totally agree. I say they got to have confidence in hypnosis. They need to have confidence in you as the hypnotist, and they need to have confidence in themselves. I'm just so in line with everything you're saying there. Good. Hey, let's see here. Is there anything else you want to say on that, or can I move to the next thing?
I think I've covered that pretty well. Although anybody who wants to contact me and ask further, I would of course be glad to answer.
Yeah, you know what you guys can do, if you have a comment or question about that, just leave a comment below on the blog, and I'll send it off. Make sure that Larry Elman knows, and maybe he will grant us a response on the blog. Hey, I'm looking through some notes I have here from you, and one of the things you kind of want to talk about, we didn't talk about this ahead of time, but I'd like to hear a little bit more about regression and pinpoint versus affect bridge. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. My wife is a great believer in affect bridge and uses it very artistically. Affect bridge, as most of the audience probably knows, follows a emotion or feeling back to its source. When was the first time you felt such and such? Pinpoint takes a different approach to regression. In pinpoint, I'll give an example, because it's easier with an example than with just my using long words. Supposing you have a stuttering client. You take them back to age 6, and you get them comfortable with some event at age 6, and then you say, by the way, are you stuttering here? No. Do you know what stuttering is? No. Okay, so whatever trauma started the stuttering is later than age 6. Supposing they say yes to those two questions, then it's clearly before age 6. Try age 3, try age 4, whatever age you try. And you will eventually narrow your time frame to where you can say, okay, you're now 5 minutes before whatever trauma started this, and you'll go there. Do you get to the same place by both processes? You would hope so. I have less confidence in the affect bridge than I do in the pinpoint, probably because I've used the pinpoint more often, but I can also give all sorts of reasons why I believe it's better psychologically. I'm sure people who believe the other way can give me arguments back the other way. But in each case, what you're trying to do is not only get the cause, but keep the subject believing in the process, because that will get the cause correct. Otherwise, you'll get a mislead.
Now, would you say that belief of pinpoint over that approach over age regression was also your father's view?
Yes, Dad stuck with the pinpoint almost entirely. I know that another point in the way he did this, by the way, initially he used what I would call the memory phase. You're looking at a TV screen of yourself at age 6. He did that for a while and gave up on that because what he found was better was what is called the revivification stage, which is you are now age 6, you are living through whatever happened. And this goes back to my credibility thing. If you can, for the first place somebody goes, pick a time and place that they vaguely remember as having been present, Christmas morning at age 5, whatever. They'll have slight memories of it, but you say, okay, you're standing in front of the tree. Who's standing to the left of you? That's something that they consciously don't remember. But in revivification, they will actually pick that up. And the fact that they picked that up will give more credibility. You use that long enough to be sure that they know what's going on. You then revivify every place you go, and when they get to the trauma, they will be reliving the trauma. And you will see what it was that actually was the cause. You'll get the cause as it occurred.
You know, I totally agree with that perspective, because in revivification, it's not just remembering, and you can ask some questions that are very, very important that you wouldn't get just by remembering, at least not to the same degree of accuracy. And, you know, you can ask what's happening, and then you can also ask, I call it the Fantastic Five, but the first three are what I'm talking about now. What's happening? What are you thinking? And what are you feeling? And the thinking part is something they might not remember, or they might not remember if they were just doing memory stuff, what they were feeling. But when they're reliving it, they know exactly what they're thinking, and they know exactly what they're feeling. Is that correct?
That's exactly correct. Let me give stuttering as a good example. My father's theory, and I believe it, is that most stutterers, notice I didn't say all, but I think it's probably in the very high percentages, 80%, 90%, I don't know, somewhere up there. Most stuttering starts because a child has tried to give a message that he or she believes important, and the adults have pushed them away to the extent where they can't get an emergency across. Now, the daughter that I'm about to refer to, my daughter, does not stutter. But I'll give you an example of something that could have caused a stutter. She was a swimmer at about age 3. She goes out to the swimming pool in the middle of our garden apartments, and she goes out with her mother, and all the ladies are having a coffee klatch, and a kid about a year and a half falls into the pool. And at a year and a half, you can't swim, and as the diaper fills with water, you've got a lead sinker around your butt. So this kid is struggling and going under. So my daughter runs over to the coffee klatch and says, quick, quick, everybody look. And the response from all of the ladies, not just from her mother, but from all of the ladies there was, go away, we'll call you when we want you, just go play. And she kept pushing this, and they kept saying no. Now, if the kid had drowned, and if my daughter had not done anything else, probably that would have been traumatic, and probably she'd have been a stutterer. Luckily, she was a good swimmer, so what she did was she dove in. Now, she's too small to rescue the kid, but she swam underneath him, pushed him to the surface, and he screamed bloody murder as soon as he hit the surface. And somebody hauled him out. So she came away with no injuries to her psyche, but you can see that if that happened to somebody and the refusal to accept the message continued and the kid had died, you'd have a real trauma that you'd be working with, and you'd have to go back and revivify and then ask, like you just said, what are you thinking? It's a perfect case for what you just described.
You know what? And that I personally have worked with stuttering, and I always get either a reduction or elimination. And you know, I don't know why there's some people, I've gotten a couple of hate letters from people who are stutterers saying that's not possible, but you and I know differently. Isn't that right?
Yes.
All right. Hey, you know, I meant to ask you this earlier, and I'm kind of got two clipboards, and that's why I didn't do it. Before we get back onto the topic of hypnotherapy and stuff, well, you mentioned that you'd kind of like to give a little bit of information about, really give the audience some background on your dad as far as a career before hypnotherapy. Can you kind of give us a thumbnail sketch of that?
Certainly. He joined vaudeville. He was billed as the world's youngest and fastest hypnotist, and as he always put it later, he found that young ladies whom he wished to date, their parents would object to them dating a hypnotist, so he gave up on being a stage hypnotist. When I became a stage hypnotist, I went up to him one day and said, "Dad, I understand what you're saying. Being a stage hypnotist while you're a teenager stunts your sex life." My father got very embarrassed because that was just too blunt for him. But when he gave that up, he remained in vaudeville as a musician, as a bit player, as a stand-up comedian. Vaudeville died, and he moved to New York, where his abilities as a stand-up comedian paid the rent for several years while he tried to break into radio. He got to be very, very important in radio in the behind-the-scenes people. He was what was called an idea man. He was a script writer, he was a producer, he was a director. My eldest brother died in the middle of this, and my father went into deep depression, as did my mother. And a relative came over and said, "Dave, the only way you're going to get out of depression is to find a way to come up with a radio show that nobody else has had the courage to try or the idea to try, something that's never been done before, and that will keep your mind occupied." And my father, solicitous of my mother and not realizing we were in a male chauvinist pig world, said, "Yes, but what do I do about Pauline?" And the relative said, "She's a woman, just get her pregnant." Well, the radio show that came out of this was Hobby Lobby, and the fetus is me.
So you gave your mom something to do.
Something like that. So the result is my initials stand for Hobby Lobby. I'm H.L. Elman, commonly known as Larry, and otherwise known as Hobby Lobby Elman. Hobby Lobby was a very popular show. It and its spin-offs resulted in a very large sum of money, about $250 million. This is back when the entire country was running on a couple of $1 billion federal budget. It raised that much money for the war effort. Dad became very famous and was beloved of the government and so on and so forth. He ended up making a movie along with Eleanor Roosevelt, used as a morale builder for the troops and a lot of other things. And then after the end of the war, he was asked by a group of physicians, a committee, to give a course on medical hypnosis because he had assisted one or two of them with some problems, and they were very impressed. That's how he got into medical hypnosis, which was the rest of his life.
So that's the bridge in between the entertainer to the teacher of hypnotherapy. Is that correct?
That's correct.
You know, you mentioned your mom. Yeah, maybe it would be interesting to know, how did your mom, if in any way, contribute to the development or teaching or really your dad's success in the world of hypnotherapy?
Well, my mother was the inventor of Dad's method of getting people into the Esdale state. He had been asked, how could you reliably get the Esdale state, because it was still at that time an accidental state. And he said he didn't know, and they're driving home that night, and my mother just turned to him and proceeded to explain, well, Dave, you've taught this, this, and this. If you connect them together, that's the obvious way to do it. And my father was just shocked by this, but he tried it and it worked. In addition to that, when you have 20 or 30 physicians in a room and you're trying to have them all practice, going from one to the other, commenting on technique becomes prohibitive. So my mother acted as what you or I might call a lab assistant and provided the corrections, her taking half the class, him taking half the class. One day he told them, well, line up for this one, because this one I've got to really do you one by one. And he looks up, and the line is longer on her side than on his side by about 2 to 1. And he's shocked by this, and he says, why is this? And one of the doctors called out, face it, Dave, when it comes to the practical, she's a better teacher than you are.
How'd your dad take that?
Well, he bragged about it. He'd brag about her, but I never did figure out if he was bragging in true pride or in chagrin. He had a pretty big ego, but at the same time, he had a lot of pride in my mother, and she was an excellent hypnotist, too.
Beautiful. I think that provides a really good background. I think in these 2 episodes so far, we've really talked about some really important information, stuff that people can use today or tomorrow in their work with clients. We've given some background. Now I'd like to kind of talk about, how do you feel, or if you prefer, how would your dad feel about the people who are adding on or working with his techniques today?
Very mixed feelings. For example, there are people who take my dad's work, understand it, and then in the light of the current society, make modifications. My father always was asking his students, do you have an improvement? The magic spot was an improvement developed by a pediatrician who had been one of my father's students. There are a lot of other examples. On the other hand, somebody who doesn't know my dad's stuff and says, well, I'm going to combine it with thus and so, and then calls it an Elman variant when it isn't or doesn't work, bothers me. There was one fairly obvious case. Somebody was doing an Elman Induction and decided to do the fractionation before they'd even done the eye closure test. And this is ridiculous, because fractionation is used as a deepener after you know you've induced hypnosis. The eye closure test shows you whether or not you've bypassed the critical faculty on the way into hypnosis. You can't swap them. It doesn't work. And yet this person was claiming they were doing an Elman variant. I cringed.
You know, how about if Dave Elman was alive today? With you know a lot about his work. You see what's going on in the world of today in hypnotism as compared to the world then. How would he be doing things differently? For example, maybe would he be teaching other people other than physicians?
I think he'd have to. At the time that he taught, there was no profession of hypnotherapy. At that time, to get even a doctor to use hypnosis was a struggle. The doctors, who had egos even bigger than Dad's, would say it was difficult for them to take instruction from a layman. And this was a major problem of that time period. Today there is a profession called hypnotherapy, and today doctors who believe in hypnosis in many cases would prefer to refer to a hypnotherapist than to sit down, take a week, learn it themselves, and use it. I personally would prefer that they learn it themselves and use it, because their semantics with their patient and their effectiveness with their patient would go sky high compared to what it is. But since I can't brainwash them that way, I'd rather have them at least refer to a hypnotherapist rather than skip hypnosis at all. So we've got a different environment. I think if Dad were alive today, he'd have to recognize this difference. But within his time period, the only way to do it was the way he did it.
And so you think he would approve of the hypnotherapy or professional hypnotism, consulting hypnotism, growing as a distinct profession? He would approve of that?
He would, with reservations, and that is, he would be very concerned with quality control. He'd be very concerned with the level of knowledge you'd need for certification. He'd be very concerned with policing the profession, because the last thing this profession needs is unqualified people giving us a bad name. So he would probably be, excuse my language, almost a nut on the question of quality control. And I think I would follow him in that.
Okay. Now I'm going to ask kind of an out-of-the-blue question. It just popped into my head while you were talking. You're not prepared for this. I have no idea what kind of answer you're going to give. What was your dad aware of this idea of past life regression? And if so, what do you think about it? And if not, what would he think about it if he did know?
Yeah, I know that very, very well. My father was very dubious of it, and there's a very good reason why he didn't believe in it. And that was that the book Search for Bridie Murphy came out during the time that Dad's classes were very, very active. And so he was constantly asked about it. Now, there are two things about the Search for Bridie Murphy that you have to know besides the fact that it was a past life regression attempt. The first is that subsequent historical research was able to prove that she didn't exist, that the entire story is bogus. My other hat is I'm a historian, so I can look at the historical research there and say, yeah, they did it right, and yeah, she didn't exist. But beyond that, if you examine the transcripts of the session, the person doing hypnosis was asking leading questions and giving hallucination-type suggestions. Thus, the subject was being led into a dream world and a hallucination. To expand on that just a little bit, there is a hypnotist that I know who swears up and down to having 100% past life regression of any subject that comes to that office. Well, yeah, except the advertising for that office says exactly that, which says anybody walking in there has already had a pre-session suggestion very strongly that this is going to happen. So
Right.
Of course, 100% is achieved. Does that mean it exists? No, that means in this particular case, you have a hypnotherapist who is producing illusions. Now, if you hand me somebody who's not doing that and you document a case, I'm willing to look at it and listen. But I know from my father's work that there were none in the 1950s and 60s.
All right, good. Well, you know what? We are come to the end of our time. I'll give you a couple of minutes, so if you'd like to just kind of get out there, to the world, anything you'd like to get out there to the world about hypnosis, hypnotherapy, your dad, or just kind of wrapping it up kind of words.
Well, thank you, Cal. Yeah, I believe that the important things to remember are the credibility, which we've covered, the quality control, which I've alluded to. Basically, the ethics of the profession must be kept high, and we must remember that we are an adjunct to the medical profession. If you have any doubt about what you're doing, make sure you have a doctor's referral. I'm talking about things that everybody already knows, but a lot of people don't practice. The other thing I will remind everybody of is test. Don't say, well, I think this person is hypnotized. I'm sorry, that's insufficient. A lot of people don't test because they're afraid that the subject will, quote, fail the test. Bad premise. If they do, back up, deepen them, try some other test. But don't walk away from testing because you're scared of it.
Beautiful. In other words, know what you're doing and let the client know that how well they're doing, right?
Exactly.
It's all about those credibilities, or like what I call confidence. All right, anything else?
No, sir. I think I've covered everything that I can say, except I'll be glad to answer questions. I'll be glad to cooperate with any serious hypnotist who wants to contact me and inquire.
Beautiful. So everybody out there, if you have a question for Dave Elman, just put it in the comments section below. I will make sure that he receives, not Dave Elman, we're not going to have a seance. Larry Elman, excuse me for misspeaking there, and we'll get that information to him. And if he can, he'll get you a response. Now, a couple things before we wrap up. As you know, I promised I'm putting together a package, and I'm going to have the information right below on some videos and perhaps some other stuff that is essential to really understanding the core, the real Dave Elman work, some stuff that really makes his book come alive. And I also want to tell you that over on the right side of the screen over here, there's always my hypnosis and hypnotherapy schedule. I've got coming up in May, the Week of Power, and in August, the Week of Power. What is that? 7 days of skill building, confidence building. You learn 5-path, and you also become a 7-path practitioner. What's 5-path? Systematic approach to doing all the things that Larry was talking about. Phase 1 of 5-path is a preparation, testing, and convincing. Phase 2 is all this good age regression. Then we go into some forgiveness work in phase 3 and 4. And then for those sticky situations where you have secondary gain and removing the cause of the problem is insufficient, we have parts mediation therapy in the 5th phase. And then we also have our certification coming up. It's a 10-day course in July. The links there or down there, they'll give you the exact information. Oh, and by the way, there's always a discount for early registration, so you want to register as soon as you can. All right, once again, I want to thank Larry Elman for coming by our center, giving us this time, and letting me send this really important information out to all of our viewers. It's really been a thrill, and if he ever comes back to California, I'm going to get him back here to do some more stuff. So thank you. Thank everybody out there who's watching the video or listening to the audio version of that. Thank you, Dave Elman. This is and Larry Elman. Thank you, Dave Elman, wherever you are. And thank you, Larry Elman, here at the Banyan Hypnosis Center. This is Cal Banyan, signing off.
This recording is the property of Cal Banyan and Cal Banyan's Banyan Publishing, Incorporated. All rights reserved for private use only. May not be duplicated without written permission.